Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. So, one thing that really interests me, I think, is the concept of underrated books, specifically underrated science fiction, i.e., authors and novels and short stories that are really rich and rewarding reads and worth your time, but for one reason or another, they're just not talked about much and perhaps deserve to get a wider audience. So I thought I would make a fun project out of this. I decided to reach out to some of my favorite writers and booktubers that I follow, and I asked each of them to give me a couple of underrated sci fi recommendations to add to my TBR. Here is what they came up with. Alistair Reynolds is a science fiction writer from Wales. He's the author of the excellent Revelation Space book series and the Prefect Dreyfus Emergency series, among many other things. So, Alistair Reynolds, do you have any books that you could recommend me?
Hello, Robin. Yeah, I when I thought about books I should pick out, I thought I don't want to overthink this. Well, simultaneously, I don't want to overthink it, but I also don't want to come up with the choices I normally come up with. So I thought I'm not going to mention. I'm not going to go down the Gene Wolfe rabbit hole or the Cordwainer Smith rabbit hole and usual slightly obscure or slightly forgotten writers that I tend to sort of harp on about. Not that Gene Wolfe's particularly forgotten, but I thought, no, let's not overthink this. So I just had a peruse of my bookshelves, the books that are not in boxes, and one that struck me, a very rewarding book that I got a lot of enjoyment out of, and I think is well worth anyone's time, is No Enemy But Time by Michael Bishop. And Michael Bishop is an American author, still writing. He's been writing since the 70s. Kind of a on the sort of literary edge of science fiction. Part of that sort of emergence of the literary American SF movement of the 70s, of which I would sort of say Le Guin, early Stan Robinson, prior to cyberpunk and everything that sort of happened after it. Not remotely interested in space opera or really anything like hard science fiction. This is No Enemy But Time is a novel about time travel, but it's a completely characteristically interesting and unique take on time travel. It's about a man called Joshua, an African American man who has some ability to sort of dream his way into the past and into sort of the prehistoric Earth. So it's a book about an interesting, distinct take on time travel, but he also gets into hominid prehistory, and it presents a portrayal of life as it was hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago, with a deeply affecting narrative that sort of switches between the past and the present. So a really good, interesting take on time travel that I think is well worth anyone's time. And then that's a sort of gateway into sort of the sort of wider oeuvre of Michael Bishop, who I think is one of those quiet writers who sort of is almost certainly underrated, but has produced a sort of substantial and intelligent body of work over the decades without ever making a big splash and becoming, the top sort of talked about SF writer, but a very, very good writer nonetheless, and worth anyone's time.
Great, fantastic.
Yeah.
Michael Bishop, I must have confessed I'm not familiar with that name at all. What
I think his moment as a writer published in the UK, I think he was relatively accessible in the 80s.
Okay.
Mass market paperback editions of his books were sort of in all the sort of SF bookshops and W.H. Smith and places like that. But he kind of had that moment, kind of came and went, I think, and then sort of other writers supplanted him. But
time travel is one of my favorite subgenres or tropes, if you like. So I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for that. Can you say when was that book originally published?
Let me have a look. Take his glasses off. Now, the disclaimer here is that I wrote the introduction to the Glance SF Masterworks edition.
Oh, fantastic.
A position of enthusiasm for the book. No sort of cynical subtext at all. So yes, 1982.
82.
And I remember seeing it in bookshops in the early 80s. But to be honest with you, I think I possibly took it out of there was a really good science fiction library at Newcastle University, and a lot of the my wider reading into SF was through the Newcastle University Library, and also Pencoed Public Library in South Wales. And I think I remember trying to read it in the sort of early 80s, but not being really up for it. It wasn't, I suppose it wasn't technological enough. It wasn't presenting time travel in a sort of hard SF nuts and bolts way that I thought it ought to. And I kind of bounced off it. But then, as often is the case, you return to a book a couple of decades later, and you find you're more receptive to it, and it speaks to you in a way that it didn't originally.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for that book. And I love anything in the SF Masterworks series, and it's got an introduction by yourself as an added bonus. So I'll look out for that.
No, it was a really great honour to do that introduction, and I had a really nice subsequent exchange with Michael Bishop about that. So I think he's a very nice man as well. I think into the bargain.
Victor Manibo is a New York-based writer. Last year, his fantastic debut science fiction novel, The Sleepless, was released, which I would argue is a sci-fi hidden gem in its own right. Underrated science fiction. I believe you have a recommendation for me, perhaps?
Sure. So I think more people should read The Lesson by Cadwell Turnbull. It is a brilliant lyrical novel that some people have been talking about, but I think more people would benefit from reading this book. It is an alien invasion story that is treated in such a different way than I've seen before. It is set in the Caribbean. It is set in the Virgin Islands. And so you have these themes of alien invasion and colonialism from the point of view of Caribbean peoples. And there's just such a lot of nuance and complexity that Cadwell Turnbull really explores, both on the human societal level and also on the really cool and interesting science fictional level. So for folks who have not checked that out yet, highly recommend The Lesson.
The Lesson. Well, thank you. I've not heard of that one or the author. So that sounds really interesting. Is that a recent novel, or?
It came out in 2019, I believe, from Blackstone Publishing, and it's brilliant.
Okay, cool. I'll look out for that one. Xueting Ni is a London-based writer, translator, and speaker on Chinese culture. Her short story collection Synopticon, which she edited and translated, is a great showcase for modern Chinese SF in translation. Are there any underrated writers or novels that you can recommend?
Yeah, there's plenty of underrated authors out of the ones I work with, because they're from like an other tradition. But there is the question of what is underrated and where are they underrated? They might not be underrated in their native environment, but they might be in another environment. But in this case, the Chinese authors, I think apart from the few who are known here, like Liu Zixin, Hao Jingfang, and people like Xia Jia and Chen Qiufan, most of them are still quite underrepresented in not necessarily always outside of China, but in the English language. So,
Right.
so the two I'd like to especially mention is one is He Xi, who is considered one of the four great sci-fi masters of China, but he's hardly known. And I really like his work. I think he's only just been translated. So
Okay.
so
Does he have any novels in English translation or short stories?
one of his novellas or novelettes has just been translated. And then there's the other author I'd like to mention is Zhao Haihong, who is part of my collection. She's the older generation of writers like He Xi, quite well known in China. She writes kind of very dynamically some children's science fiction stories as well as fantasy and adult science fiction for adults. Yeah, she just is a really good all-rounder, like great characterization, great plot, storytelling, and integration of the science fiction. But maybe more tending towards the soft science side of it. So, and she has been published, as well as in Synopticon, she's been published. I think one of her stories is in Lightspeed, but not very much.
Xueting later sent me a link to this book, Adventures in Space, which is a science fiction anthology published just recently in April 2023, including newly translated work by both He Xi and Zhao Haihong, among others. Whitney is the owner of the BookTube channel The Secret Source of Storycraft, another great place for picking up science fiction and fantasy recommendations. Hi Whitney, what have you got for us today?
Well, hey Robin. The first book that I have for you is a book called Remnant Population by Elizabeth Moon. This book is kind of a nice little short book, and it's one that I don't hear a lot of people talking about. Some of the things that I like about it are that it is an elderly protagonist. I believe she is 70, and it is a book about a lady who is finished with her life. She is all done, and she decides that she's going to stay behind on a planet that's being abandoned and live out the last few remaining years or months of her life as she wants to, where nobody's going to tell her what to do. And things don't go according to plan, and there may or may not be aliens. There's a little bit of a mystery in this one, and it's very much a slow burn, and I had such a fantastic time reading it. I wish more people talked about this one.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great choice. I've not read any Elizabeth Moon before, so and that's quite interesting that it's got an older female protagonist, because that's not something we see a lot of in sci-fi. So I'll definitely check that one out.
Yeah. All right, awesome.
When do you know whenabouts did that book come out?
Sure, I can look it up actually.
I'm just curious.
It's absolutely cool. I should know this off the top of my head. I apologize that I do not. It came out in 1996.
Okay, great, fantastic. I'm going to add that one to the TBR.
So the reason I said I've got two books, or possibly two and a half, I wanted to sort of segue into another book, which is Under Heaven's Bridge by Michael Bishop, who we've just discussed, and Ian Watson. And this is Michael Bishop's only collaborative novel. I think Ian Watson has done other collaborative projects, but certainly at the time this was Ian Watson's only collaborative novel.
Right.
And this is actually, despite what I said about Michael Bishop not really being interested in sort of high SF and space travel and space opera, this actually kind of leans into that a bit, in that it's a novel about first contact. It's about an interstellar expedition to another solar system, and then contact with an enigmatic alien species who seem to be sort of part machine and part biological. And for me, it was I was already a fan of Ian Watson, and this was, I think, the sort of gateway book into Michael Bishop for me, because it sort of exposed me to his writing, and I couldn't tell you where one begins and one ends. I think it followed from one or two stories that Michael Bishop had done already in this sort of environment, future. Ian Watson was sufficiently intrigued by them to propose a collaboration, and this is the result. It's a typical, a slim science fiction novel of its time in the days when science fiction books didn't have to be 600 pages long, but it's still sort of packed full of really interesting ideas. And though I haven't reread it in about 30 years, it's surprising how much of the imagery still remains with me. So I think that always says a lot about a novel, that little bits of it get sort of stuck in your brain over the decades. It always means that there's something of intrinsic value in the book. I'll tell you when it was published.
Okay.
I couldn't begin to guess. I think 1981. So
81.
It
Okay.
predates No Enemy But by Time by 1 year. So it's from that sort of interesting period in sort of British and American science fiction, where it was sort of like the late 70s wave was beginning to break, but cyberpunk and humanism, humanist SF, hadn't really established itself. So it was quite an interesting time, I think, where sort of lots of possibilities were open. But yeah, very good, creepy, interesting novel about first contact. There's little more to say other than it will reward any reader.
I think more people should read and talk about The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. This is a book that came out in 2020 from Del Rey Books. And it is, again, my preference for the literary and lyrical writing comes out because this book is very literary. The language of the prose is so gorgeous and crisp. But on top of that is a really epic space opera story about captain of a freighter ship transporting a very special boy, and this boy being kind of a linchpin to a change in the entire galaxy and the way humans live. So I think it deals well with the themes of family and technology, and human hubris is also a very recurring theme in this book that is treated with a lot of heart. So highly recommend The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez.
This one is actually a trilogy. I apologize, I don't have the first book as a single book by itself. The trilogy is called The Complete Fuzzy by H. Beam Piper. The first book is called Little Fuzzy. And this is a book that I hear so many people talking about in terms of John Scalzi rewrote that first book in a book called Fuzzy Nation. And I finally went back and actually reread the original, and it is spectacular. It is a fantastically awesome slow burn. It's very lighthearted, but deals with a lot of deep themes. And it's about humanity in a far-flung future who lands on an alien planet that is supposed to be uninhabited by sentient life. And as the colonists move in, they start to discover these little fuzzy creatures who learn a lot faster than they expected. And they start asking questions like, what is sentience? Is their definition appropriate? And are these creatures something that needs to be protected or not? So I highly recommend it. It was pretty awesome. So definitely check that one out if you haven't.
Great. I've never heard of that writer or that book, but it sounds really intriguing. I will keep an eye out for that one.
Well, that one is a particularly older book. And the nice thing about it is, I know that book looked a little chunky, but the first book is actually rather short and it's rather self-contained. So if you decide not to continue with the series, you're still satisfied. And both of those books are very accessible, very easy, slow burns to get into.
Okay. You said it's an older book. Whenabouts did that one come out?
Sure, let me check that one out for you so I don't tell you the wrong one. The first book. The first book came out in 1962.
Okay, great.
So I thought, well, so we started with Michael Bishop, and then we sort of segued into Michael Bishop and Ian Watson. So what better way to proceed than an Ian Watson solo novel? And
I think I understand what you mean by 2.5 now. Sorry. Okay.
Right. And I picked Oracle not because it's necessarily the best Ian Watson novel, although it is very enjoyable on its own terms, but simply because you could pick up any of his novels and be rewarded. They're all different. He's just produced a sort of continuous chain of richly imagined, off the wall, very, very unpredictable science fiction novels since the early 1970s. And again, things I read in Ian Watson novels just stay in my brain. This one it's a typical. I mean, Ian Watson novels don't readily submit to easy summaries. So this is a book. It's about, again, it sort of touches on time travel. It's about a Roman centurion who turns up in present day Britain. But there's also sort of government conspiracies. There's stuff about the IRA in there. It's a mishmash of stuff that wouldn't ordinarily occur to you to sort of fit into the same pages. But because it's Ian Watson, it does. And it sort of goes off in tangents you won't be expecting, and just it's unfailingly inventive and surprising. But it's also just a really good read, and I think that's the thing about Ian Watson as a writer. He has that ability to just make you want to keep turning the pages, because there's the sort of the mysteries he sets up are absolute humdingers. Real. The kind of stuff that reminds us why we fell in love with science fiction in the first place. Sometimes the resolution will take you in a direction you weren't expecting at all, and it might be completely bonkers, off the wall sort of logic that comes in, but it's still fascinating and refreshing for all that.
Great. Ian Watson, and is he still around?
Yes, yeah, very much so. He's very active. He's sort of, I mean, I don't want to sort of speak to someone else's career, but I think he sort of had that period where his work was maybe perceived as not being as commercial as sort of mainstream publishing really wanted. So he was a very much a writer whose work was easily obtainable through the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s, I think he became a bit of an awkward peg in an awkward hole in terms of the way SF was marketed in the UK. So his work sort of, I mean, he's dropped out of the conversation to some extent, I think, because of that. But every one of his books is worth revisiting, and he's still active. He's very involved in sort of convention running. He's one of these writers who is the kind of glue that holds international science fiction together. So he's a great collaborator across boundaries, full of enthusiasm, still fizzing with ideas. So absolutely a writer who we should still be talking about all the time, but who I think for largely for commercial reasons has just slightly dropped out of the conversation for the last decade or so. I mean, Oracle, I think, was one of his last sort of mainstream books published by a mainstream publisher in the UK, and I think this is sort of late 90s. Again, just a little squint. So this was 1997, so we're going back more than 20 years, 25 years now. I think there was 1 or 2 books came after this. But after that, you had to sort of seek him out, I suppose, more rather than sort of having pushed at you all the time. But a really fantastic writer. I discovered him. I mean, I was kind of aware of him. I'd read 1 or 2 things by him, but it was really through the pages of Interzone, which was the British SF magazine that I sort of got into. They started well, they always published Ian Watson basically from the get-go. And when you started reading an Ian Watson story, you never knew where it was going to go. It could go into sort of hard SF, space travel, time travel, creepy Gothic creepiness, stories about creepy Northumberland legends, things like that. So, and a brilliant. I mean, he can just write about anything brilliantly, and he does character really well. He does dialogue really well. He's one of those writers that's just got a really good arsenal of technique that he brings to the page. What I should also say about Ian Watson is that he was and is very prolific at the short fiction length, and there's a ton of Ian Watson anthologies going back to the 70s, the kind of things you can easily find in secondhand bookshops.
Right.
So you just pick up one of those anthologies and there's like 10 absolute stone cold classic short stories, and then you pick up another one and it's another 10 classic short stories. It's a really great way of deciding whether he's for you or not, and then you can sort of branch off into the novels.
That's it. All of these books are going straight into my TBR. Let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of these books or these authors, and feel free to share your own underrated sci-fi recommendations. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for some more science fiction content.